Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Latter-day Disciples podcast. I'm excited to be joined today by Kyle Jacobs of the Latter-day American podcast. Kyle is a lifelong member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He served a mission in the Nevada, Las Vegas West Mission from '04 to '06 and is an avid lover of music. He is also a lifelong student of American history and believes strongly in the divine origin of the United States. In 2020, he launched the Latter-day American podcast, which explores the connections between gospel principles and American values. He currently lives in Santan Valley, Arizona, with his wife of 12 years and his two beautiful children. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be on.
Absolutely. So I was really excited. This is the first opportunity we've had to interview someone who does another podcast. And your podcast, I definitely resonate with what it said in your bio there about how you feel so strongly about the divine origin of the United States. I'm definitely in the same category there, would consider myself a patriot, although I know that the definitions on what that means have morphed over the years. But I'd love to hear a little bit about what got you started with the Latter-day American, what got you interested in politics, and what has your approach been trying to bridge, to make the connection between the gospel of Jesus Christ and the American political system.
Yeah, thanks for having me on here. So as far as, what's gotten me interested in politics, it's funny because you almost hear the word politics and it's a little bit cringeworthy. And, the famous saying, you don't discuss religion and politics. Well, in my podcast, we discuss both. So it gets pretty interesting. But ultimately, I grew up just loving America. It's been something that was just instilled in me just from a very, very early age. I've, followed all of the, major elections as I was growing up, kind of listening to my parents as they navigated through everything back in the day there. So, and as far as the podcast is concerned, it's funny, as you said, we launched it in 2020, and that's kind of a typical year for trying to change the world, I guess. But with the political environment that we were in 2020, it got so heated and so messy. And I would notice that we would have lots of disagreements, even within the walls of the church, and not necessarily in the buildings, but typically members of the church have felt pretty similar on things throughout our history. Certainly there's always been disagreements, but politically speaking, it's been fairly homogenous there. But the church is so global now. And with the wonderful efforts of our missionaries and members and the gathering of Israel, we have all types of people in the church now. And so as these political debates just went back and forth, I recognized that even members of the church were, instead of having good functional conversations where we're learning and growing and listening to one another, we're kind of doing what the world has been doing, which is just picking a side, digging in your heels and fighting about it. And I kind of looked at that and just wondered, what's going to clear this up? Not only for the members of the church, but for anybody who cares to listen and who cares to make righteous decisions. Thinking was, what would the Lord have us do in this situation? And specifically, how would the Lord have me vote? And that's what the Latter-day American podcast really explores and tries to figure out. And it's based on principles as opposed to events, because new events just keep coming. And 2020 was the year of new events. We're living through a year that is just going to be written in the history books for forever. And they were just so rapid fire. And without an understanding of the principles, then we're just going to be tossed to and fro with every wind of political doctrine. And I figured, with the divinely inspired country that this is, the Lord wants us to make the right decisions here. He wouldn't just give us something so precious and just say, okay, do whatever you want with it. And so really jumping into the principles of everything is our goal, so that when the next big thing happens tomorrow or next week, on the political sphere and the media and your friends at work are trying to pull you, 3-4 different ways, you can fall back on those principles and say, because of this principle that I know, I know what to do and I know how to vote on this particular item.
I love that. That's awesome. And that is some of the direction that we've been receiving from the brethren and from the church leadership is, President Oakes has given some beautiful talks. He gave a talk a couple general conferences ago that was the Divine Constitution, and I was so excited when he started his talk and said, "I'm going to talk about the Constitution," and I was like, "Everybody, be
Right.
quiet! Like, I need to listen. I need to listen to what he has to say because obviously he's such an authority. Having worked for a Supreme Court justice and his own career in law, and just diving into the Constitution and, as you were saying, the principles that our country was founded on. And I think what he said specifically was that we need to have loyalty to principles over
Mm-hmm.
parties or people. I would also add positions because, you can take a certain stance on any sort of issue. And sometimes, we need to account for circumstances. We need to account for
Mm-hmm.
nuance. There's more factors that come into play with that. So I found his counsel really timely. So tell me how you define a political principle versus a policy, a person, or a platform.
Yeah, and I would add a party in there as well. So let me kind of back into that a little bit, because when you think about parties and policies and people for that matter, we've got a lot of charisma out there in the political sphere. People who are very persuasive, and again, those things change. And on the cynical side a little bit here, just kind of the textbook when it comes to a politician, they want your vote and they're going to tell you anything you want to hear to get your vote. And that's not always true. We've got a few who do stand by principles, but a lot are not that way. They are attracted to power, they are attracted to your vote, and policies are so easily swayed by who is the loudest, right? And media really jumps into that as well. It jumps into, okay, well, what's the pulse of the country right now, and we're going to morph a policy around that. The problem is it's gotten so gray because the pulse of the country is all over the place. You can have someone on social media and they've got a loud voice and makes you feel like there's 100 million people behind them on it, and there's not. Right? There's no authority behind that at all, and they may not be representing the vast majority of Americans, and in most cases they're not. We're seeing that quite a bit now with a lot of the pushback that has happened just recently, as far as kind of highlighting the media and some of the biases that the media has. We can see there that they may be pushing something, and there's a counterculture that is forming, and it's a resistance to that because they don't represent who you are. Whereas the principles are foundational. The principles aren't supposed to change, right? And I think there's a really good example of that, and it's in my own state here in Arizona. And this kind of demonstrates a little bit what I'm talking about here. So we've got a senator here. Her name's Kyrsten Sinema, and she's a Democrat. And her election, or the whole campaigning process between her and her Republican opponent was super heated. It was super nasty. On both sides. Senator Sinema ended up winning, and I'll tell you, at that point, again, with media and just with knee-jerk reactions and how visceral our reactions are, a lot of us felt that, like, oh my goodness, she is not going to represent us, because a lot of her talking points were so extreme. And so we had a lot of worry about that. I know a lot of people did. And it turns out there have been a number of issues where she has voted opposite of what you would expect. She voted against Democrats on a number of things, from securing the southern border to the Build Back Better plan that President Biden has pushed. And she's taken a lot of heat from her own party and her party leadership for doing that. And in her defense, as she has defended herself, she said, look, I ran on the platform that I didn't want corporate taxes to raise because I felt that corporations and small businesses, they're the lifeblood of our economy. And if we raise their taxes, that's going to have a trickle down effect that's going to hurt everybody. That was her principle. She felt that higher taxes, at least in that situation, would be detrimental to the country. And so then you zoom out a little bit, and so now you've got the Nancy Pelosi's of the world and the other Democrat Party leadership who are giving a lot of pressure to her, and she's standing up to it. And so I was really impressed with that. Whenever she runs for office again, I will likely not vote for her, but I respected her so much more. And for me personally, it helped me to sleep better at night to know that, if I don't agree and if she's somebody who I didn't vote for, she still has morals, she still has principles, and she had the backbone to follow those. And so, the principles don't change no matter what's going on around you.
Yeah, I feel like Christian Cinema represents what I would say is probably now an outdated political philosophy that, during the primaries or the initial election, you go as far to your side as you possibly can. You want to be the rightest of the right or the leftist of the left to win in a primary sort of election. And then once you do, you want to go to the middle. You want to be a moderate. Again, this is outdated political philosophy at this point because now you just stay as extreme as you were, or you get more extreme.
I saw a I guess a video series. BYU puts on this series about religious freedom. Really, really neat. You can register for it every year. And they had Kirsten Sinema and Mike Lee from Utah together, and they're opposite sides of the aisle there. Mike Lee is a Republican, very staunch defender of the Constitution, and it was so neat to see them talking and speaking together as co-workers. And there didn't seem to be any animosity there, and they even talked about that. They said, it's unfortunate that the media really highlights, the boxing matches. They highlight the extremes. And unfortunately, party leadership on both sides, just like you've said, they feel they need to be as extreme as possible. And there's all these people who you wouldn't even call them moderate in their political philosophy. Mike Lee is not a moderate. He's a conservative. And Kirsten Sinema is a liberal. But they work together. And so it's almost like they are moderate in their political philosophy, when what they actually are, they are moderate in their ability to work together. And I really appreciated that.
Yeah, and I think that they are a great example in a sea of really bad examples because, as we said, everyone is going, as extreme as they can most of the time, it seems. And the public is mirroring that. There's no longer, I don't know if there ever was a civil dinner time political conversation, but if there was that in the past, it no longer exists. It becomes so heated, and people, there's this tendency to just double down on whichever side of the aisle you fall on. And there's not really this return to the middle that I feel like, yeah, they represent really well. It was this willingness to collaborate, a willingness to compromise, an eye on, as you said, the principles and on the greater good rather than necessarily the pursuit of individual power.
Yeah, and I would add to that individual fame. Everybody wants the YouTube hits. They want all the views and the likes. And the more outrageous and outlandish that you can be, the more you're going to get that. And to your point, and that's what the brethren have been talking about. President Oakes just gave a really, really good, I think it was a commencement address at Ensign College about the need to be civil and to be loving. And I love how he threw in there too, because this is something that we explore on our podcast. How do you do that while still defending the truth and pushing the truth? I've been really fascinated with the call for all Christians, really, but especially Latter-day Saints, to wield the sword of truth. And I'm studying that quite deeply now, and to figure out, how do we do that and still maintain the unity that Elder Renlund talked about in the last conference, right? And so it seems like, if you're wielding the sword of truth, our natural gut is saying, all right, we're going to destroy, we're going to, and even in conversations, I'm going to destroy you, I'm going to blow you up, right? And that's not necessarily the way that it needs to happen, because you're not doing any good if you do that. There is zero progress being made, because once you get personally attacked, then you're either walking away or you're defending and you're doubling down on your stance. And so you could have the greatest message in the world, but if you come at somebody too aggressive, and if you're not listening to somebody to understand where they're coming from, there's no way you're going to soften any heart. There's no way you're going to do any convincing whatsoever.
100%. This is something that I've thought about really extensively, is that there is a lost art called candor. The ability to tell someone the truth in a way that makes them listen. You do it with kindness. You do it with gentleness. You do it under the influence of the Spirit. Now, granted, a lot of the venues through which we're having political conversations these days don't really promote any of those things, right? Like, we're talking on social media where there is no contextual information, there's no tone of voice, there's no facial expressions. Everything comes across heated. A lot of the times, purposefully, there's kind of a disconnect in how people act on social media versus the way that they would act, if they were actually face to face talking to someone. And so that's a challenge that we need to overcome. And it's one of the reasons that I don't engage on many political debates online. But if I'm sitting down and having a conversation with someone face to face, I wholeheartedly believe that it's not only, we're not only capable, we are responsible for being able to share the truth, especially doctrinal truths, things that are inarguable, things that we know from modern revelation or ancient scripture are 100% true. This is how it is. Truth is a real thing. We have a responsibility to share that, but we have to share it the way that Christ would share it. He would not get heated. He would not get defensive. He wouldn't get angry and roll his eyes and shut down. He would be looking to show love, to show comfort, to represent the other person's perspectives too and respect those, while also standing for truth. And so I think it's a lost practice in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And the other thing, you notice how the Savior taught. He asked questions,
Mm.
and obviously, he knew the answers to everything, but the questions weren't meant for his knowledge. The questions were meant for the people he was asking.
Mm.
And ultimately, he did obviously understand where they were coming from, and when he spoke with them, and that's kind of the purpose of his parables. He spoke in a way, and in, I would guess you would say, analogies that they would understand. He talked about being a shepherd. They understood what that was all about, right? That's what they lived. That was their lived experience. And I know that that's one thing that's hard for me, and I think it's hard for everybody, is you have to understand that people have different experiences than you, and they grew up in different households than you did. And so their perspective is different, and that doesn't mean that truth is relative. It's not. Truth is truth. And so you can have a conversation, let's say, about abortion, and that's a heated one, but that's one that's really clear within the church, of where the church stands on that. There's lots of other things that they don't make many comments on, but abortion's not one of them. And so there's a couple of ways that you can handle that. Like, you can come swinging a big stick and and call someone a mass murderer if they've participated or supported an abortion. That's not going to do anything, and that's not Christ-like. That's not the way that the Savior did it, right? He asked questions, and he understood where they were coming from. And I think, to your point, with social media, you just get these sound bites, you get these memes that for some reason you think wraps up an entire lifetime of experiences for somebody, where we look at memes and they're great for a laugh, and sometimes they're great for a mic drop type of moment, but it doesn't go into why somebody feels the way that they do. And until you can tap into that, similar to sharing the gospel, there's no way that even if you are 100% right, you don't know how to apply it to that person's life. And again, they're never going to choose the right in that situation because you've taken no time to figure out how to apply that to them.
Absolutely. Several thoughts from what you just shared, because I think you hit on a lot of really great things. That last point that you were making of keeping in mind that people have different experiences, different backgrounds, that is so essential to understanding why people might be coming at it from a different place than you. Because I think sometimes we become so convinced of our position as the right position, like my opinion is the right opinion. Chocolate ice cream is the best. And I don't understand why you would think but vanilla ice cream is the best. Vanilla is the worst. And in those moments, I found that it's so helpful to revisit the things that I actually know about the person that I am talking to, that I'm concerned about, that we have these political differences, because we need to know and have faith that we know people's hearts. And that even though we might have disagreements on policy prescriptions, I still know that you are an amazing person and a child of God, and that you are valued, and that you are doing your best, and that you're doing so many good things. Sometimes I fear that we let someone's political identity become more important than the person that we actually know them as. And that is so dangerous. That is divisive. That is serving the adversary. So something to just kind of put out there and be aware of. Another thought that I had while you were talking, you gave the example of abortion. You're right. This is one the church has been very clear on its stance on that. But we're seeing more and more members of the church who I would say are identifying more with a different stance when it comes to abortion. And that's part of why it's become so heated. It's become heated within members of the church too. And, you could come at it and say, well, you should just do what the church says, but I don't really think that's a good answer for everything. I
Right.
think that we need to have our own experiences with the Lord, our own search of doctrine, and come to our own conclusions, hopefully guided by the voice of the Holy Ghost. One of the things that I think causes these problems, we're talking about principles. And one of the issues that I feel like we're running into is a conflict of principles, not necessarily just the practices. So, for example, on the abortion issue, you could take what I would say is probably a conservative leaning perspective and say, my principle is the protection of life. And we are all children of God, and a fetus is a child of God. There's a spirit that is anticipating and growing in that body, and we need to protect that at all costs. On the other side of the aisle, you could have a liberal perspective. And I've talked to members of the church who are liberals and who have this different perspective on abortion. And it's centered largely around protecting the mother, who is also a child of God, and who is also a soul and worthy, and worthy of love, worthy of the love of God, worthy of consideration in these sorts of things. And so you have two principles, and both of them are true. I would argue both of them are almost the same, and they're coming in conflict with each other. So in that scenario, like, what do you see? Do you agree that that is where a lot of our contention might be coming from? And if so, like, how do we process that?
Yeah, and again, man, I hate to be redundant, but I think asking questions is really the way to go about that. Because again, with our little sound bites and memes, especially on the topic of abortion, same thing with LGBT. These stances come at you, and and you want to give this little knee jerk reaction that will completely turn people off. With abortion, it gets particularly difficult because those who are typically pro-life see abortion as akin to murder, right? And so, and like I said earlier, you're going around telling someone that they're a murderer, they don't feel that way. They wouldn't compare themselves to a murderer. So what I would suggest in that situation is ask a question. So for your example there, we could say, okay, the life of the mother, absolutely essential. And we're talking about a life for a life. So, but what are we actually talking about? Are we just talking about those situations in which the mother's life is in jeopardy, right? And if we are, then there's some common ground that we can come across. We can say, okay, all right, let's think of this as an exception. Okay, the if the mother's life is in jeopardy, where it is one of those situations where, and man, it almost makes me cringe speaking so casually about this, but if it's a situation where either the mother is going to die or the child is going to die, you have to make a decision. I think we approach that situation as an exceptional situation. And so one person's talking about the exception while the other person's talking about the rule. And so that's where we can find that common ground. We can say, hold on, let's define this for a second. Like, if we're talking about the rule, should just abortion be legal, free and clear, and let's do this no matter what happens. You don't have enough money, so you're going to go get an abortion because you can't support a child. That's one side of it. Or the other side is, this is going to be a truly exceptional experience, and we have to make this decision. I think if we find that common ground, then we'll find that we believe the same thing. We're just arguing from different sides of it. And so if you can ask questions, you can define that, and you can say, oh, no, wait, hold on, Meghan, we are talking about two different things. If we want to talk about a legislature that would allow for an abortion in the situation of the mother being saved, her life being saved, then let's talk about that, because me personally, I'm very anti-abortion, and I would be up for a bill like that, right? And then on the flip side, we can say, okay, just elective abortion, that you get it if you want it. Can we agree that is a problem? Because if we're talking about, avoiding the inconvenience of a child versus killing the potential life, that argument doesn't really hold water. And I think there's more common ground than we think. We just have to dig a little bit instead of just beating each other over the head with slogans and platforms. We have to truly understand what we're talking about so that we can get to that point. Now, to your point, as people are becoming extreme, you may run into where you do find somebody who just wants to have abortion free and clear, just right off the street, and that's unfortunate. I think the other unfortunate thing is the media highlights those exceptional situations, and they do a lot to try to mask the real issue, right? So they'll mask the idea that abortion is killing a fetus and is ending a life with all sorts of other things. And on the abortion topic, they'll say, oh, well, this is a man oppressing a woman. Men are writing these laws that are affecting women, and I don't agree with that. Okay, if you don't want to agree with that, that's okay. There's a lot of flaws in that logic, because we have a lot of women in the legislature, and the Supreme Court justices and everything. But that's a different topic. Let's stay in our lane and talk about, is that fetus a living child of God, right? And so we've got all these distractions all over the place. And when the other person is speaking, if you're just waiting to respond with some mic drop moment, you're not getting anywhere.
Yeah, the abortion issue, it's interesting because I do think it's one where a lot of the common ground has been destroyed. Frankly, like it's very much a topic that we take an all or nothing approach to, for good or for ill. But I like what you're doing, because what you're talking about is what President Oakes talked about as being able to moderate and unify. So again, looking for compromise, looking for the middle ground, looking for something that we can unite around.
I think it's also really important, once we do that, there may come a point in your conversation, just like what you said, where truth is truth. We don't want to overcorrect and just say, okay, I will agree with a complete untruth, right? And so that's what makes it really, really difficult, because the conversation may come to a point where you're like, what you said is not true, and the way to either stop that argument or come to that point is also important as well, because again, if you reach that point and you say, the truth here is this, and this is what I believe, and similar to in any type of gospel conversation, bearing your testimony, and then you leave it at that, right? And then we can walk away. We're still friends. We still love each other. And you know what? Maybe we're both going to be thinking about that conversation a little bit. Maybe we're going to chew on that a little bit more, and listen to what the other person said. Whereas, again, if you've just burnt a bridge, the only contemplating that's going to be happening after that is how much you dislike that person now, and now you're sad because you lost a friend. So learning how to disconnect that conversation, and knowing when you've gotten to an impasse where it's like, okay, we do not agree on this point. That, I think that's an important principle that we've also lost as well, because people burn bridges and they want to say, if you don't believe politically the way that I do, you are quote unquote capital the enemy, right? And then families are broken up because of that.
And that's absolutely not what the Lord wants. And that, I would say, that's not acceptable behavior for us as disciples of Jesus Christ. That's not something he would ever do.
Agreed.
Luckily, we're talking about this kind of in an interpersonal situation with family or friends. But I just want to point out that this is the beauty of the Constitution. Because although we could have a hard time navigating this situation, our Constitution is built to withhold against situations where there is no common ground and to allow for agency. And that's the really beautiful thing, is that, we come at this like it's an all or nothing debate, when in reality, the Constitution has provisions written into it that will leave it up to the will of the people. And in certain places, that means that abortion's going to be free and clear,
Mm-hmm.
up to and even past birth in some places. And in other places, abortion's not going to be illegal after 6 weeks, or even more strict than that. And I find that that's beautiful, because I've gotten to the point personally where, unfortunately, I don't think that abortion is something that is going to go away until the Lord comes.
Right.
And in the meantime, the best that we can do is let the Lord take care of it. We stand for truth and righteousness. We vote with our conscience, whichever way that may be. And, the Lord knows all of the details. He knows individuals' hearts, their intentions, their backgrounds, their histories, why they would or wouldn't advocate for abortion for themselves or for someone else. And He's the one who can take all of that into account. We can't. So, in my opinion, the ability for states to discern and for the voices of the people to be more heard by setting state law and by voting in that way,
Mm-hmm.
it's beautiful. And to me, it attests to the inspiration of the Constitution.
Absolutely, and it highlights the importance of our need to be involved. We talk about, and I wish I had the scripture handy, but just the idea of, like, once the people choose the wickedness, then the Lord's not going to help us anymore. Obviously that's a total botched paraphrasing, but clearly the Lord made a covenant on this land, right? And we read about it in the Book of Mormon, top to bottom. And I believe that to some degree our founding fathers understood that covenant as well, which is why a belief and a responsibility to an accountability to God is an underlying theme of the Constitution and of the lives of these men who created it. But this is our country. So to your point, we say we the people, we kind of say that flippantly, and you see it on the trucks riding by, and that's what, again, what the Latter Day American podcast is trying to instill. Like, you guys, we have a say in this, and yeah, the Lord is going to work everything out, and I believe our responsibility is to keep the covenant of this land. And that is to follow God, keep the commandments, and He will bless this land. It says it over and over and over in the Book of Mormon. And we have the ability and we have the influence to guide this country to stay on that covenant path. Now, are we outnumbered? Time will tell. It's a pendulum that swings back and forth. And abortion is just another great example here. Roe versus Wade, and that's going to be overturned by the Supreme Court, causing all sorts of issues where it's like, well, when the political tide sways again, what's going to happen? If we are sitting on the sidelines, then I think I think that is displeasing to the Lord. He gave us this country and He gave us a voice so that we could guide the country and make sure that we keep this American covenant. And so the fact that the Constitution allows this, and allows us to have representatives and to vote and put representatives in there as a republic to represent what we desire for this country, makes it all the more necessary for us to be involved and to not be so apathetic and not so scared to get into it. Because as we get into these things, it does get heated, and we don't like contention, and especially as disciples of Jesus Christ, we don't want to fight, right? But Christ didn't back down from things. Like, he made a lot of people mad. And so, not that we need to go around burning bridges and making people mad, but we live in a time where evil is called good and good is called evil. And if we are oblivious to that fact, we're not paying attention, and we don't want to know that truth, because that is an absolute truth right now. And you can look at it a couple of ways. You can be really discouraged that we're at that point right now, or you can look at it another way and say, this is actually exciting, because we are seeing prophecy being fulfilled, which means all of the wonderful, glorious prophecies that are coming our way are going to be fulfilled as well. We're watching the scriptures and the prophecies of all the prophets before us. We're watching that come to pass. And for me, that's such a faith-building experience. And it's a gird up your loins type of experience. And for me, that's why I'm like, all right, let's go. Like, the battle lines are drawn, not between people, right? Not like, me versus Meghan, we're going to fight this out. But the battle lines between good and evil are drawn. And I think of the Temple Recommend interview question that says, do you support or promote any teachings, practices, or doctrines contrary to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints? And what's interesting to me is, in that Temple Recommend question, it does not say people. It doesn't say, do you support or promote any people who think differently than the church? It says teachings, practices, and doctrines. That's what we're fighting against. And if somebody holds those teachings, practices, or doctrines, then it is our job to help shine the light of the gospel so that they can see, so that the deception, wherever it came from, can be counterbalanced by the gospel, so that perhaps they can drop those evil teachings, practices, and doctrines as well.
Yeah, that's really insightful. I appreciate that that perspective of the Temple Recommend interview questions, guiding us to what we need to be looking out for. That's really interesting. I want to add an additional plug on top of what you were saying about being involved and making sure that our voices are heard in as much as it is possible. And one of the things that I would encourage everyone to do as a part of that process is to actually learn about our political system and to read the Constitution, not just to read it to say that you've read it. You also need to have a true perspective of the conditions and the philosophies and the insights under which guidance it was written. There is a huge underrepresentation of truth as it pertains to the founding of our country. And please, 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 if you find a conflict between what you are hearing in the news media, in your history textbooks, on your social media feeds, something that conflicts with what we know from the scriptures, please err on the side of the scriptures being right. This is something that has been very frustrating to me, is that we hear so many things about George Washington and Christopher Columbus and Native Americans and all of these different things. And you guys, we have so much insight into all of these events that is 100% true, undiluted, a true history preserved for us from the foundations of before this country was America. And we're not using that to our advantage. So first and foremost, keep that in mind. Second is we need to understand the true natures of the founding fathers. Their names have been disparaged. That is something that Satan has been very interested in doing, is destroying real heroes, people that we could look to. Were they flawed? Yes. Did they have terrible, terrible sins? Yeah. And they're going to be accountable to God for them. And I'm grateful for God's justice and his mercy. But none of those things negate the fact that they did an incredible work, a work that they were set apart to do. I feel very strongly about this. I'm related pretty directly to Thomas Jefferson, and so I feel invested familially.
Right?
Familially, he was my first cousin, 8 times removed, so we're pretty close. Yay for that family search activity.
And I'll tell you, you got my blood flowing on that one too, because I couldn't agree with you more. It's funny. I remember as a kid growing up, like, okay, who's my hero? And, I can always say that my dad was my hero, and that's absolutely legitimate. But as a kid, it was a football star and all these things. As an adult, it's George Washington. And my wife just laughs at me all the time because I'm the biggest George Washington fanboy out there. Yeah, and to your point, and all of these founding fathers, they, yes, they've got sins in their past. Who doesn't? We look at these things and we look at these men and women who are a part of the founding, and we don't look at them as people, right? We look at them as like, oh, okay, well, you're George Washington, you were supposed to be perfect, or you're Thomas Jefferson, you're supposed to be perfect, and that's just, it's not fair. That's not fair to them. So in 200 years, how is somebody going to look at me, especially out of context? And we think about, obviously George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and I'll tell you, we could do 3 or 4 podcast episodes on those guys, and I would just absolutely love it. But you look back and you read their histories, and you realize, like, oh man, okay, they were slave owners. Like, we cannot deny that, and we do them a disservice, and we do ourselves a disservice by saying, well, it wasn't that bad. Well, that was bad. But it's so interesting that nobody wants to look at that and say, well, wait a minute. During the Constitutional Convention, Jefferson wasn't a part of that, but he tried to get this in the Declaration of Independence, that slavery was going to be done away with. And George Washington and James Madison, who was also a slave owner, at one point Benjamin Franklin was as well, although he became an abolitionist later in life. They all wrote things into the Constitution to slowly get rid of slavery, and that inner conflict of, like, hey, they're slave owners and yet they're advocating for abolition. Why is that? And no one wants to dive into that, because jumping into history requires some effort, right? And as you read biographies, it unfolds to you why, they were born into this system and they were trying to get rid of it. Now, could they have had more courage and just said, okay, I'm getting rid of all my slaves? They could have, and they should have. There's no doubt about that. But it's not so black and white as what the history wants to tell you. And so,
You're totally right. And see, this is what I'm talking about. This is the contextual history that no one talks about. Is, and another perspective that I would say, just kind of summing up what you were just saying there, is that the same Constitution that everyone likes to point to and say was based on slavery and encoded slavery and wrote slavery into the DNA of our country was the Constitution that abolished slavery. And so, these are just the things that we really need to have a true perspective. And it takes discerning with the Spirit, because you can read a ton of things that are all false, or you could read things that are partially true and partially false. That's most things. And so, we look through a glass darkly when we try to understand the past. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, but it means we have to do it with the guidance of the Holy Ghost. And I really appreciate your perspective on those things. And again, just encourage everyone to try and understand these people for who they truly are. And one of the things that I like to think about, not so much is about what their flaws and what their sins were, but what they became. Because I hope that that's how people look at me. We don't all want to be remembered for the worst parts of ourselves. We want to be remembered for the ways that we overcame the worst parts of ourselves. One of my all-time favorite church history stories is with Wilford Woodruff in the St. George Temple. And he had a vision of the founding fathers. And they came to him in the temple and essentially chastised him, saying, "We are the reason that you have this temple. We are the reason that you have freedom of religion. We are the reason that the restoration was even able to take place, was the work that we did. Why have you not done our temple work?" And you better believe he got the message, because he went and wow, they baptized a whole bunch of people, men and women, all, very many of them related to the founding of America. Some of them were some of the great poets and writers of the age. I love that Jane Austen is on the list. I'm a fan of hers. it brings so much joy to my heart knowing that she's a covenant member of God's family and of his eternal church now. And one of the things that brings me so much joy is that George Washington and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, not only did they receive their ordinances in the temple and become purified members, covenant members of this church, but they were ordained to be high priests. They were given an elevation in the Melchizedek priesthood because of their faithfulness. And so again, we have more perspective and we need to represent that. If we don't have it, we need to get it. It's part of our responsibility, not just as Americans, as you were saying, but also as covenant disciples, because you're right. This country is under covenant. It sounds to me like you've read a little bit of Timothy Ballard.
Oh yeah. Yep. He's a modern day hero for sure. Yeah,
I know.
I'm in my office right now looking at his three books here. Absolutely wonderful. I'm so glad too, because when you called out that they were ordained high priests, I thought the same thing. As like, you've read Ballard, I know it.
I read that account a long time ago in a different book,
Oh
but Timothy, Tim, obviously he repeated it in his books,
yeah.
and absolutely recommend his books, The Washington, Lincoln, and Pilgrim Hypotheses. They're all separate books. I just said it in one sentence, so it sounded weird, but
Right.
I mean, they're all fantastic. And I mean, founded on the idea that these great men and women had an understanding to a degree of the work that they were doing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't know if that means that in vision, George Washington saw the Latter day Temple. Tim makes the argument that he did, and I
Mm-hmm.
can see it. Or, that Lincoln knew why the Civil War was happening and that the preservation of religious liberty and unity in this country was going to be crucial to the gathering of Israel and the events in the future. Again, Tim does a great job of making the argument that those things are true. But highly recommend those books. I really like the Pilgrim Hypothesis and the deep digest that he gives about the tribe of Ephraim coming from Britain and the scattering of Israel from that lens. And as someone who's just very, very white, it makes me it makes me happy to see some of my ancestry going back directly to the 12 tribes of Israel. So that was a tangent in the extreme. We've mentioned in passing the covenant that is upon the American land. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, if you read the Book of Mormon, and it's funny, I guess maybe it's just the lens that I view things now, having been so invested in America and my love for this country. The Book of Mormon is just tribute and a love letter to America. It really is. If you read about Nephi's vision, chapter 1 verse 13, and he sees Columbus, he sees George Washington, he sees the Revolution, and time and time and time again, they talk about, if ye keep the commandments, ye shall prosper in the land. And in a nutshell, that's the covenant. Keep the
Mm-hmm.
commandments and you will prosper. And we have seen over and over again that take place. You think about, I'll tell you another book that's really, really good, that I would recommend, that really drives this home, and it's called The Seven Miracles That Saved America, or something like that. It's Tim
Yeah.
or Stewart, Ted Stewart, Ted and Chris Stewart. That's who it is, and it shows you like there are so many things that have happened for this country that should not have happened. It's impossible. And as you read about George Washington, not only in Ballard's books, but you read all these accounts, his escape from New York and the
Mm-hmm.
fog coming down, allowing him to escape, and all of these things that have happened that have preserved America. It's no coincidence whatsoever. The things that have happened in this country that show that the Lord has a vested interest in this land. This is the promised land, but we have to keep our end of the deal. We have to keep the commandments, and the covenant is, again, it's not complicated. Keep the commandments and you'll prosper. And you can see those instances in history where that didn't happen, and you think about the Civil War and the things, and and there's a lot of arguments to be made that that was a part of the punishment of the saints having to flee America because we weren't preserved, we weren't helped. I know Brigham Young had some thoughts about that, but you see that sometimes the Lord has had to smack us around to get us right, and the Civil War is a direct result of that. And you think about Lincoln and the great leader that he was to finally recognize that. Because as we talked about the founding fathers and their faults, if you think of America as a person as well, she's been learning and growing too, and that's what gets me frustrated. We can, I know it's very taboo, but we could talk about race in America, and it frustrates me a little bit to consider where we are now as being just as bad as the during the civil rights movement in the 60s or during slavery. And it's just, again, it's so unfair. If we were to imagine America as a country, I mean, I'm sorry, as a person, and she's had to learn and grow. And
Mhm.
it's as we as a people have learned and grown, as our knowledge has been expanded and our understanding and our faith has increased, we've had to get rid of some bad habits. Just like I eat too much. I need to get rid of that bad habit. America has some bad habits and continues to have bad habits that need to be fixed. And so certainly we're not a perfect country whatsoever, but it's a little unfair in my view to really just highlight all of America's sins while pretending that the rest of the world doesn't have them, and not giving credit for the progress that we've made. I'm passionate about that as well.
Agree with you. It's interesting because on the one hand, we make these assumptions and these statements that are founded on the basis that we haven't changed, we haven't improved. And on the other hand, we say that we've changed so much and the Constitution is no longer applicable as a result of that. And so, it's really interesting, this kind of paradoxical approach. But I love the analogy that you gave of America as, I would say a person, and I would say a woman because,
Lady Liberty, of course.
she is our
Yeah.
country. Yeah, Lady Liberty. She is our nation, and a woman who has grown, who is still flawed, deeply flawed. And I would relate the Constitution back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this episode. These are the true principles. And when we can't agree on principles, my hope is that we will turn to the principles of the Constitution because the Constitution has it all. The Constitution has agency. It has forgiveness. It has repentance. It has accountability. It has charity. It has all of these things that the Lord put there. He is the founder of this nation. And I'm so grateful for that knowledge. Now, obviously, I feel like we're in a really hard place as a country right now. Things are going to get harder. A lot of my study of the last days has been founded on my question of what is going to happen in America, because a lot of the better known prophecy relates to Jerusalem or to the world at large. So, that's something that I've delved into and in studying that. It's hard. It's going to be rough. And I do think that things are going to get worse before they get better. But the good news is that even if the majority of our country chooses to disregard the covenant that America was founded on, we can still choose it. We can still choose to be the righteous that inherit the land. And there's going to be a cleansing process here in the very near future, and the same rules apply. If we are willing to turn back and be righteous and to keep our side of the covenant, which is adherence to God, right? One nation under God. We can become
Mhm.
that individually and collectively. And I have great hope that this will still be into the millennium, into eternities. This will be a land of liberty. And I'm really grateful. One of the things that I read that was a prophecy of sorts from Brigham Young was about the American flag. And, he was asked essentially what would happen to the flag. And his reply, this is him, not me, is he essentially said that the American flag will be the flag of Zion because the American flag represents liberty. I know that that has become kind of controversial, but we're the ones who can make that true. And we do so by falling back on that covenant, by choosing to be the Lord's covenant people, to let righteousness reign on the earth. And I know that as we do so, this land will be eventually be able to become everything it was meant to be.
Absolutely. And it starts with us as citizens. It's no different than living our religion in the face of everybody scoffing at us. My favorite scripture of all time, and I had to pull it up here because I should be able to quote this, but I love it so much that I don't want to miss a word. It's Moroni chapter 9, verse 6. And, Mormon this is a depressing chapter. It really is, because Mormon is an epistle to Moroni about how bad everything is. And the Nephite nation, this once great nation, is worse than it could ever be conceived of at the time. But I love what he says here in verse 6. He says, "Now, my beloved son, notwithstanding their hardness, let us labor diligently. For if we should cease to labor, we should be brought under condemnation. For we have a labor to perform whilst in this tabernacle of clay, that we may conquer the enemy of all righteousness and rest our souls in the kingdom of God." I love that, because it, again, gives me courage, where it's like, it's not that I don't care what everybody else is doing, but notwithstanding their hardness, we have a labor to perform. Like, at the end of the day, we can only control so much. And we are so blessed to live in a country where we have a certain amount of control over what happens here, but we don't have absolute control. That's why the ability to convince, the ability to get involved and to have these conversations is, again, so important. I'll just scream that to the high heavens, because that's our labor. Our labor is to preserve this nation. Our labor is to make sure that the foundations of the gospel are not excised from this country. Religious freedom is under attack. The Constitution is under attack. And you know what? In the end, I believe, and again, this was, I love what you brought up with Brigham Young, because there was another quote here. I believe it was President Benson said that when the Savior comes, the American flag is going to be waving right behind him. And, the fact that the Constitution is going to hang by a thread, but will be saved by the power of the priesthood, which includes men and women, it is prophecy that this country is going to stand. But if we abandon our labor, then we're breaking our covenant. We're breaking the American covenant. And so, the media can be as loud as they want. Social media can be as loud as they want. And we can't help that. We can't control that. But we have a labor to perform whilst in this tabernacle of clay.
Man, if I could get a picture of Christ in front of the American flag,
we have a requisition.
I would add that.
Totally.
Add that to my collection.
Right. Yeah. I've got to find. I'll have to follow up. I've got to find that quote, because I remember reading that quote and just bawling like a baby. I was just like, oh. So maybe I made it up. So I'll have to follow up with you.
Well, Kyle, thank you so much for your time. Everyone, be sure to check out the Latter-day American podcast for more inspiring messages. Be sure to get involved in all the ways that you feel inspired to. Educate yourself on history, on the background of the Constitution, on the inspiration that went behind it. Read the scriptures. They talk so much about the principles that our nation was founded on, and the beautiful work that the Lord did in laying the foundation for the restoration by the creation of the American country. So do all of that work, and then participate in the ways that you feel inspired to. And again, I know that the future is bright for those who love the Lord and who are interested in preserving our country. So Kyle, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.